In early 2020, my friend told me about this album that he'd listened to during a car trip. He told me that it was an album that simulated what it was like to have dementia. It all goes downhill from here. The work of the Caretaker, particularly his albums exploring memory, are some of the most creative, beautiful, and horrific albums I've ever listened to, and some of the most important experimental music made in the last few decades. There's a lot to be said about the work of James Leland Kirby, but a lot has been said already. Instead, I'd also like to talk about something else. Analog horror is a relatively recent development in the space of online horror. It has its origins in ARG-type horror, meant to be interactive with its audience, where the viewers, through various videos, clues, puzzles, and websites, would piece together the story for themselves. ARGs, or alternate reality games, have been around for over a decade on the internet, and one of these, known as Local 58, started in 2015 and gained traction in 2017. Local 58 is a story told through the lens of old local news broadcasts and public access style program blocks, with bits of found footage style clips interspersed within. The story of Local 58 is currently incomplete, and its plot is unclear, although it's most likely about an alien invasion. But what is clear about Local 58 is the buzz that it caused. With only 9 videos on the channel and over 20 million views, the storytelling of Local 58, with its non-linear structure, grainy VHS aesthetic, and invocation of hazy, unclear memories and vibes within its audience, proved to be a major success. Now you could be forgiven for asking, Bella, what does that music you mentioned have to do with scary VHS tapes? Good question. In 1999, English musician and Twitter shitposter James Leland Kirby released his first album under the name The Caretaker. Selected Memories from the Haunted Ballroom is the first of 3 albums by Kirby in what is known as the Haunted Ballroom Trilogy, which I can only describe as an amalgamation of 1930s ballroom music, whatever records Kirby found used at the store, and sounds of shit being shuffled around. Not kidding, by the way. Listen to this. All of this combined to make a love letter to the film The Shining. Most notable about The Shining is its use of dated ballroom music, not the kind of music a ton of people still listen to much. Less Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald, and more Al Bowley. The biggest example of this is in its ending scene. It's a very long, slow shot of the camera dollying in across a room, through a doorway, to reveal an image on the wall, dated 1921, with the film's antagonist, a 1970s father who goes insane and tries to kill his family, standing proudly in the very center. During this, Al Bowley's 1934 hit, Midnight the Stars and You, is heard playing, eerily reverberating through the halls of the hotel as the camera nears the picture on the wall. This scene in particular influenced the musical aspect of hauntology. Hauntology is a very broad concept that has to do with the idea of cultural memory persisting beyond its initial relevance. In this instance, it's the feeling of a haunted ballroom serenading its guests/victims with songs from the past, from a time when the ballroom mattered, the time before the people who danced to that music were dead and pop culture moved on. The time when the ballroom was full and vibrant has long passed, however. For now it is desolate and decrepit, with the ghosts of those dancers and that music now haunting all who enter. A more scholarly explanation of all this is above my pay grade, but in summary, the spooky music from The Shining became the basis for the early works of Leland Kirby under the Caretaker alias, the name being taken from the movie.
I'm sorry to differ with you, sir, but you are the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker.
Notably, Selected Memories ended with Kirby's own edit of Midnight the Stars and You, with effects and distortion over it that make it sound much more ghostly. After a couple more albums exploring this haunted ballroom concept, Kirby began to experiment with the idea of actual memory being represented by music, with the distortions over the original samples he used representing memory loss. The first few albums are a bit less listener-friendly in my opinion.
What? What's the matter with you? All I said was a little too much. It's no big deal, really.
And are much more experimental, but important nonetheless. This concept became a lot more refined in 2008's persistent repetition of phrases, where tracks like Unmasking Alzheimer's and False Memory Syndrome began to resemble later Caretaker works much more closely. After this, the Caretaker finally had its breakout success in 2011 with An Empty Bliss Beyond This World. This was the first full album Kirby made about dementia. It's hard to understate the degree to which this album changed both Kirby's path as an artist and, frankly, just how good it is. On a nice set of speakers reverberating throughout your room, it's probably one of the coolest ambient albums ever made. Similarly to the previous album, An Empty Bliss is composed of dusty old music from the 20s and 40s, slowed and reverbed, played on a broken record player. The sound of the album is very pleasant, generally. The sound does evoke feelings of being somewhere alone, hauntingly alone. It feels like being alone in an airport at 2 a.m. It makes you think of an old person staring blankly in a nursing home, someone who would be able to talk to you and hold a conversation, but who was clearly not quite all there. If you've ever had a grandparent or other relative with dementia, even if they're still self-sufficient and healthy, at some point you begin to notice that there's a certain level of lucidity that's absent from their eyes. They seem just ever so slightly more blank than they should. An Empty Bliss is this in musical form. The album is just a snapshot in time, however. There is no progression. Nothing gets worse. So what if it did get worse? Well, Kirby had a 6.5-hour answer to that question. Everywhere at the End of Time is probably the second scariest piece of music I've ever listened to. The scariest is directly inspired by it. It's hard for me to come up with new things to say about this album. It's been reviewed countless times, and I've picked it apart, put it back together, and helped make fan projects. All I can say is that no words can really say what the album does through its music. It is that poignant in its message, without a single intelligible word said throughout the album, unless you're really paying attention. If you haven't listened to it before, I have to say you should before finishing this video. For many reasons, including spoilers, but mostly because it would really suck for analog horror to be your introduction to these songs. The album consists of 6 albums, or stages, each corresponding to a stage of dementia. It is a full portrayal of the disease through its entire progression, ending exactly where you'd expect an album about a terminal illness to end. The ending isn't relevant to this video, and not worth spoiling. What is most important are the early parts of the album, where the music goes from lucid and fully intact, save for being slightly slowed and a bit reverbed, to losing its sense of identity, and eventually getting to a point where songs begin blending together and falling apart by stage 4. The uncanny nature of this music gave it quite the reputation, particularly on TikTok, being scary and 6.5 hours in length. With this in mind, it's not a huge leap to go from eerie, ambient music inspired by memory loss and vinyl records decaying to horror media that uses the aesthetics of old VHS tapes. The first example I'd like to talk about is the FNaF VHS series by Squippus McGrimpus. To those unfamiliar, Five Nights at Freddy's is a horror game series about a chain of animatronic restaurants, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and related restaurants, inspired by Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza, where, in-game, numerous children were murdered and went on to possess the robots. The series, making its debut in 2014, was a huge breath of fresh air into an otherwise stale horror genre. The original few games were very serious and grim in their tone, what with their run-down pizzeria atmosphere and outdated entertainment media. Things began to change in the series, however, past the 4th installment. The games, known for their infamously convoluted story and lore, adopted some more comedic elements than previously. Many of these games were still scary, but eventually, particularly with its latest installment, 2021's Security Breach, the series had leaned into being much more kid-friendly and marketable than its older fans were happy with. Naturally, a fan series based on these games using the analog horror concept was bound to happen eventually. The games involve looking through grainy CCTV cameras and take place primarily in the 80s and 90s, so the whole VHS aesthetic is a bit of a no-brainer. Squippus McGrimpus' FNaF VHS is by far the best known, most popular, and in my opinion, best analog series based on the FNaF franchise. Several others have popped up since its release, but the rest are inferior in quality and are very derivative. The first entry in this series is very reminiscent of Local 58. It's a training tape for maintenance on one of the animatronics. A primitive-sounding text-to-speech bot is reading cleaning directions while music plays in the background. The video ends abruptly when the torso of the robot is removed, revealing a censored child's corpse. The second video marks the first ever Caretaker crossover. See? 5 pages into the script, and finally, here's the connection. Bonnie joint movement testing begins as a very similar video to the first. Not about illicit substances, this video starts as footage of an animatronic rabbit, Bonnie, having his limbs and their movement tested and evaluated. Midway through the video, the character starts slinking off every time the camera cuts away. Eventually, the footage changes to another character known as the puppet, who is, unsurprisingly, a puppet, hovering over a gift box, eventually starting to emit a loud, deep wailing. All the while, a song plays. The song in question is a section of piano from Leighton & Johnstone's 1929 song, The Wedding of the Painted Doll. The same portion of the song is sampled as the title track of An Empty Bliss Beyond This World. The same song is later reused for a short part of a video 3 parts later in the series, titled Non-Existent Video. Skipping ahead yet another 3 parts into this series is our first ever crossover with Everywhere at the End of Time. Security footage shows a conversation between 2 of the ghosts possessing the animatronics as they stand in a party room late at night. After they discuss the nature of their fate and try to console each other, they both leave, with the shot lingering on the empty room as a reverberated version of George Olson's Lullaby of the Leaves plays. This song is a very important sample in Everywhere at the End of Time, first being heard as Stage 2 track C2 Misplaced in Time. This song is emotional in both contexts, to say the least. Several videos later, a different cover of The Wedding of the Painted Doll is used in animated cartoon. Memories opens with Al Boley's cover of the song, This Is Romance. Hal Kemp's rendition of this song is the first track on An Empty Bliss Beyond This World. All you're going to want to do is get back there. Worth mentioning at this point is the significance of Al Boley to the Caretaker, given the use of his music in The Shining. Finale ends with the names of the serial killer's victims being displayed on screen after he gets his comeuppance, and as the names are visible, a portion of Leighton & Johnstone's Piano Successes medley is played. This sample is used multiple times across Everywhere at the End of Time and An Empty Bliss Beyond This World, most notably as Hidden Sea Buried Deep on Everywhere at the End of Time Stage 3, and as the third track of An Empty Bliss Beyond This World, The Great Hidden Sea of the Unconscious. So that's FNaF VHS, to my knowledge, the first crossover between the work of the Caretaker and analog horror. Up next is another series inspired by Five Nights at Freddy's, The Walten Files. The Walten Files is a series set in an alternate version of the Five Nights at Freddy's canon, where no children were murdered at the Fazbear restaurants. Instead, the series focuses on Bunny Smiles Incorporated and the story of its founders and eventual collapse. In-universe, Bunny Smiles, abbreviated as BSI, develops animatronics, much like those from the Fazbear restaurants, for their own entertainment media and restaurants. Obviously, if you haven't seen it and want to, spoilers up ahead for the Walten Files. The plot revolves around an event revealed in Episode 3, where Felix Kranken, one of BSI's co-founders, is asked by friend and co-founder Jack Walton to take 2 of his children home from a school event. Felix, an alcoholic, drives drunk while taking the kids home. The 3 get into a car accident, and the 2 children are killed. Felix hides the bodies in the woods and doesn't tell Jack what happened. Presumably suffering a breakdown from grief, Jack disappears and is eventually presumed dead. After this, one of the animatronics, a rabbit named Bond, begins a killing spree, causing several other animatronics to become possessed as well. The series has not yet explained what exactly happened to Jack, nor why Bond started killing. The first episode of the series takes place after the accident and is a training tape for new employees. It is meant for a facility caretaker to an external storage facility containing the decommissioned animatronics. The latter section of the video follows this caretaker, Brian Stells, as he is going to his first night on the job. Yes, the word caretaker is going to appear in this series many, many times. He finds the facility, a bunker hidden in the woods, and enters to find Bond and, presumably, the rest of the animatronic cast inside. The rest of the cast, known as the Showstoppers, Banny, Boozoo, and Shaw, aren't shown in this scene. Shortly after entering, Bond attacks Brian, whose perspective is being filmed in a mixed media version of the Blair Witch style of found footage cinematography. Brian runs into the woods after being tracked down and killed, later being reported missing. The second episode starts with another company training tape informing employees about the Relocate project, where the characters and equipment will be moved from their restaurant, Bond's Burgers, to the facility seen in the first episode. Next we see a facial movement test for Banny, where different facial expressions are demonstrated. Eventually, the background fades out and we see Banny moving her eyes left and right slowly as she stands in a black void. As her eyes go all the way to one side, her face fades away, revealing a distorted human face underneath, which quickly fades away. Her eyes go to the other side with her normal face and human face interchanging until her normal face comes back as her eyes drift around, only for her to start staring directly at the viewer. Her human face comes back and a short piece of Al Bowley's Heartaches plays.
Let's go, motherfuckers! The most obvious reference to the Caretaker that anyone could possibly do. Woo!
Heartaches is basically the main theme of Everywhere at the End of Time. It is the first song in the album and reappears in multiple forms throughout its full runtime. After a disturbing interlude of starving rabbits and unnerving audio and visuals, we return to the training tape format. We see a crudely drawn cartoon version of Shaw the Sheep, one of the aforementioned showstoppers, instructing us on the proper materials for facility caretakers. As she does this, we can hear an edit of Russ Morgan's "Goodnight My Beautiful" playing in the background.
We recommend all facility caretakers to have all needed equipment.
The second most obvious Caretaker reference. This song was first sampled as Libet's Delay on An Empty Bliss Beyond This World. Later reappearing in multiple forms and incarnations throughout the run of Everywhere at the End of Time. After being haunted by Jack Walton, we are given a tour of the facility by Shaw as Goodnight My Beautiful plays and ghosts of the murdered haunt the tape. Normal stuff. Basically, the rest of the video after that is more found footage of facility caretakers evaluating salvageability of the contents of the bunker. One wanders off, horror movie style, and gets murdered and shoved into another animatronic. Par for the course. In between this episode and the next episode, Bunny Farm, are a few shorts, one of which is from the perspective of a message to Sophie Walton, our yet unseen presumptive protagonist and the living child of Jack Walton. Lucky You starts as a farewell advertisement for the Bond's Burgers restaurant before eventually cutting to a bunch of shots of the animatronic characters twitching with text on screen, a message from Bond to Sophie. While this is happening, a more complete version of Al Bowley's Heartaches is playing. On to episode 3, Bunny Farm. Listen, I'm gonna be honest, this video is an hour long.
Oh my goodness!
I'm gonna have to be brief with whatever explanation I give for it. In the script, this is written as deep fucking inhale. All caps, bold, italic. In-universe, Bunny Farm is a glitched-out video game that was left unfinished by BSI. Sophie, with occasional appearances from her girlfriend Jenny, gay people, plays the game and begins to remember things that were repressed in her memory by both trauma and pills she was given as a child. The game is clearly buggy from the start.
All of us working. Really? What?
As Sophie progresses through the game, it becomes more and more clearly haunted by Bond's victims, including, but not limited to, her mother, Rosemary Walton, and another technician named Susan Woodings. To skip a few, Susan Woodings is the first victim revealed to Sophie, and it's shown that she now possesses Banny the Bunny. Sophie then learns about Felix's bad marriage and decides to leave that baggage to couples counseling and Jerry Springer, deciding to move on to the Boozoo minigame up next. Just before this, however, our character walks into another room and the screen is black as a song plays, Franz Schubert's Der Leiermann, as played by Sir George Henschel. This song was sampled on the Caretaker album Patience After Sebald, a 2012 album made by Kirby as the soundtrack to a documentary on the late German author W.G. Sebald. That track was called I Have Become Almost Invisible, to some extent like a dead man. After this minigame scene, the music plays again before Sophie moves on. After finding out how Sophie's mom was brutally murdered and stuffed into a robot, the game glitches out and brings Sophie and the viewers to this creepy-ass well. The shot lingers before slowly, a figure appears and rises out of the well. As he does, the song Water Lilies in the Moonlight by Maurice Winnick plays. This song is from Stage 1 of Everywhere at the End of Time, appearing as track B3, Quiet Internal Rebellions. Note, in the full Everywhere at the End of Time upload on YouTube, B3 is replaced with track E8, Long-Term Dusk Glimpses. It's still called Quiet Internal Rebellions, but a different song is being played. The original can be found on the Caretaker's Bandcamp and in other YouTube uploads of Stage 1. After this, the figure from the well basically dumps exposition onto Sophie, telling her, and the audience, how her siblings died horribly and went on to haunt their quasi-animatronic doll thing after their death. In retelling this, we are shown the school event that her younger siblings, Ed and Molly, are attending. Faintly, we hear the song Masquerade by Jack Hilton and his orchestra playing in the background. This song was used in The Shining. Again, it's hard to understate how important that film is to a lot of internet horror. The song reappears shortly after in a scene where we see a series of phone calls Jack makes to Felix, where Jack angrily asks about the whereabouts of his children and why Felix has ignored him for several hours. As Jack gets angrier, we start to hear a very uncanny loop from a section of Masquerade. After all this, Masquerade is used as the end credits for the episode.
Midnight shadows fade, no one's left at the masquerade. Everything is through, dear, but my love for you, dear, lives on.
Fortunately for me, that's all of the Walten Files content relevant to this video. Other videos by creator Martin Walls use similar Caretaker-era music a lot, but none specific enough for me to be willing to dedicate more time to. Anyway, there are a lot of other analog horror series that use Caretaker-style editing on similar-ish music that gives off the same uncanny vibe, like the Washington Wormhole episode of Alex Gasanis' series Monument Mythos, which is an alternate history thing that also imagines, what if there were huge fucking creatures living in major landmarks and monuments, and what if they were terrifying? I can't possibly think of anything else to put in this, and I think at this point, the thesis of this video is pretty clear. Modern internet horror and analog horror owe so much of their DNA to the Caretaker, and credit isn't given. Not enough, in my opinion. So with that, I'd like to thank my lovely partner Cooper for the emotional support. I'd like to thank the Caretaker Fan Project server for the inspiration and the motivation, because I was so excited to show them this. I'd like to thank my lovely friend Jojo for introducing me to the Caretaker, and I would like to especially thank my teacher, Ms. McClary, without whom I would not have learned Premiere, and I would not have been able to make this video at all. If anyone would like a follow-on to this video with more content related to this, let me know if you have anything. And until then, ciao Bella.